Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Week 2 lecture on the theory of evolution by natural selection. I hope you enjoy it. Now, on to Week 2 learning objectives. These are the things you should be able to do at the end of this lecture. Number one, identify and describe Darwin's 5 principles of evolution by natural selection. And number two, identify and describe 3 sources of genetic variation. All right, before we get into some new information, let's review what we learned in week 1. Evolution is a biological theory which states that species undergo genetic changes over time. So they do not stay the same forever. One species can actually branch off to form 2 different species. Number 2, it's any change in the frequency of alleles in a gene pool. So evolution is not humans came from monkeys or apes. Any change in the frequency of alleles in the gene pool of a population, that is evolution. So what does this mean? Well, populations of organisms, they have different physical traits. And these differences in their physical traits are caused by variations in DNA. Over time, the organisms with the best traits, they tend to survive and reproduce. Therefore, their alleles in the gene pool will become more common. All right, so we're on to Darwin's 5 principles of evolution by natural selection. So these are things that Darwin noticed in his travels aboard the HMS Beagle when he went around the world for almost 5 years. Well, one thing he noticed is that he observed that there are a variety of different traits within a population, which means that all populations are diverse. No 2 members of the same population are exactly the same. For example, in that picture on the top right, those are all African male lions. However, you can see that none of those individuals are exactly the same, especially the mane. Some of them have a very full mane, some of them have hardly any mane at all. So those are variation within a population of African lions. Number 2, offspring. Species in the wild produce far more offspring that can actually survive. And if you remember from ecology, that means the biotic potential exceeds the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. For example, in sea turtles, when the mother sea turtle lays eggs, on average, only 1 out of every 100. So about 1% of those little hatchlings actually make it to adulthood to have baby sea turtles of their own. So the vast majority of offspring in the wild do not survive to reproduce. And building upon the last slide, where there are far more offspring produced in the wild than actually survive to reach adulthood, well, the reason for that is number 3. In the wild, it is a struggle for existence because in the wild, there are limiting factors in any environment. Those limiting factors are things like disease, predators, amount of food, amount of water, amount of space. These are all things that limit the size of a population. Well, organisms must compete for resources in order to survive. So, if you can see on the top right, you can see 2 eagles. They're competing for the same food source. One of those eagles was a little faster and it got something to eat, while the one on the right was a little too slow. And that leads you on to number 4, survival of the fittest. Individuals with favorable traits will endure the limiting factors and gain the resources they need. They will be more likely to survive. Thus, those organisms that survive are more likely to mate and reproduce, thus passing on their traits or their genes to the next generation or the next generation's gene pool. And those organisms that do not have these traits tend to not survive, and their genes are lost in the gene pool. And Darwin's 5th and final principle of evolution by natural selection is what's called common descent. And that's where Darwin suggested that the species we see today on Earth evolved over time from a single original common ancestor. So, looking at that tree on the left, that tree of life, that simple common ancestor would have been at the base of that tree. And then everything, all life on Earth that's ever existed, has branched off from that common relative that we've all had. All right, so now that we know there is variation in the physical traits within a population, Where does this variation come from? Obviously, it needs to come from the variation in the genetic sequence of these organisms or the variation in the genes or alleles in the gene pool. So, number one, the first source of this genetic variation is random mutations. Mutations are any change or mistake in the DNA sequence following DNA replication. Now, although these are usually neutral or harmful, some mutations in the genetic code may affect an organism's fitness and actually help it to survive. It could give it an adaptation. For example, you see in DNA number one on the image on the left, you have a cytosine bonded with a guanine, which is circled. But after replication in number two, instead of a cytosine or C bonded with a guanine or G, you have a thymine T bonded with an adenine A. That's a mutation. That is a mistake in the genetic code. Now, that mutation is most likely going to be neutral, or if anything, it'll be harmful. But in the rare instances, if it gives that organism a better chance to survive or reproduce, then it will become an adaptation and will be more likely to be passed on to the next generation of organisms. Now, another source of genetic variation or diversity within organisms or populations is what happens during the sexual reproduction process of meiosis, and that is genetic recombination. Now, if you remember back in cell reproduction, genes are shuffled randomly due to independent assortment of homologous chromosomes and also due to crossing over. So you can see in the image on the left, you have the homologous chromosomes of a parent organism undergoing meiosis, and you can see the process of crossing over where new allele combinations are formed when homologous chromosomes actually exchange genetic information. All right, and the final source of natural genetic variation or diversity within populations is something called gene flow. And that is the movement of genes from one population to another. So, in other words, it is migration. It'll be one organism emigrating out of a population and immigrating into a separate population. For example, in the image on the left, you can see where a darker or tan colored beetle has emigrated out of its population and joined a population of beetles that are more green colored. Now, this immigration or gene flow has altered the gene pool of the second population when it introduced the tan colored genes into the gene pool. And that's another way where you can increase the variation of the genes or alleles within a population. All right, that is all for the lecture in week 2. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next week.